talk about the beautiful business of milk today. Yeah, yeah. I got milk. Let's talk about milk. Oh yeah, baby, let's talk about the beautiful business of milk today.
All right, folks. Ditch those lattes and grab a lassie because we're diving headfirst into the world of milk in India.
Specifically, Orissa, India, and the economics of milk production, especially for those small-scale dairy farmers trying to make a living in a global market.
You know, we got some research on this, the economics of milk production in Orissa, India, with particular emphasis on small-scale producers. And it is fascinating stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a topic that goes way beyond just milk, right? We're talking about livelihoods, sustainable farming practices.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about how these farmers in one of India's least developed states are actually competing.
Yeah, because it's easy to think small farms, big potential, but is it really that simple, or are we talking about an uphill battle here?
Well, the study kind of starts by setting the scene in Orissa, painting this picture of a place where most families rely on this mix of crops and livestock. And you might be surprised to hear how crucial milk actually is.
Okay, surprise me. How crucial are we talking?
Think about this, 33%, a full third of their total livestock output value comes from milk.
Wow, a third. Seriously. See, now I'm picturing these massive herds of cattle. But then I remember reading that most of these farms are, like, tiny.
Tiny is an understatement.
Yeah.
We're talking most farms coming in at under a single hectare.
Wait, seriously? A single hectare? I mean, can you even picture that? 2 cows just squeezed onto a football field's worth of land.
That's the reality.
Yeah.
And it's exactly why boosting that milk yield per animal is so essential for these farmers. Now, to get a grip on all of this, the researchers, they use this concept of typical farms.
Okay, meaning what exactly? Like if I walked into a movie about dairy farming in Orissa, these would be our star cows.
Exactly. So they chose 6 different farm types to represent the range of operations. You've got your small farms, your large farms, some with cows, some with buffaloes.
Ah, okay, so it's like a strategic sampling to get a sense of the diversity within Orissa's dairy sector?
Exactly. Because it lets us compare them directly, you know?
Yeah.
See who's thriving, who's just scraping by, and most importantly, why.
Okay, I'm hooked. Walk me through these typical farms who are our main players.
Okay, so picture this. Our smallest operation, we'll call it IN2CO, has just 2, literally 2, local cows on less than a hectare of land. Then you've got IN2BO, also small, but they're working with 2 buffaloes and a bit more land.
Okay, I'm already feeling for these guys trying to make it work with such limited resources.
No, and we're just getting started. Don't forget our mid-sized contenders, IN6CO and IN6BO. They're both located a bit closer to urban centers, which comes with its own set of advantages and disadvantages. IN6CO is rocking, get this, 6 crossbred cows.
Okay, so they're going for higher milk yields, I see.
Exactly, trying to find that sweet spot between traditional practices and, commercial viability. And then you got IN6BO, also with 6, but these are grade buffaloes.
Interesting, buffaloes instead of cows. We'll have to get into what makes them different a bit later. So those are the mid-sized guys who are the big players in this scene.
Okay, so for our final 2, we're going from small time to, well, if not quite big leagues, at least bigger pastures, right? We've got IN15CO with 15 local cows and IN9BO rolling with 9 local buffaloes. Both of these farms are situated in more rural settings, and they face a different set of challenges. Access to common grazing lands, for example, which has a huge impact on their costs.
Okay, so we've got our 6 contenders, each with their own unique setup, their own challenges, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to the milk, right? So how does Orissa stack up against the rest of the world in the milk production game? What are we talking about here, a gentle moo or a full-on dairy drought?
Well, you might want to grab an umbrella because we're definitely talking about more of a drought. More of a drought, unfortunately. See, the average milk yield in India is already pretty low. We're talking only about 694 kilograms per cow per year.
Okay, so not exactly drowning in milk, I get it, but that's the national average, right? Where does Orissa fall on that spectrum?
Even lower, unfortunately. We're talking a whole quarter lower than the Indian average.
Oof, okay, so not great. Especially when you consider the average dairy farm in the U.S., for example, they're pulling in something like, 11 times that yield?
You're not kidding. It's a massive difference in output.
Which makes you wonder, how do these small farms even begin to compete? I mean, is it even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing, and it's a crucial point. Lower yields don't automatically equal lower profits. It's not just about how much milk you're getting, it's about the cost of producing that milk.
Right, because if your costs are super low, you might still be able to make a decent profit, even with smaller yields.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because the study actually dives deep into cost analysis, breaking down all the expenses these farmers are facing.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the big costs we're talking about here? Is it just about, like, the price of cattle feed?
Feed is a big one, for sure, but it's so much more than that. Think labor costs, how much they're paying their workers, the price of land, veterinary care if their animals get sick, even access to water. All of these things factor into the final cost of a liter of milk.
Right, so it's about the whole operation, the whole shebang, not just what the cows are munching on.
Precisely. And this is where understanding the economics gets really important because you can start to see how different factors like access to grazing land or proximity to urban centers can really impact a farm's bottom line.
Fascinating. Okay, so we're talking cost analysis, which, I'll be honest, makes me want to grab a calculator, maybe a spreadsheet. But before we get lost in the numbers, let's talk about the human side of this equation, because at the end of the day, these are families trying to make a living. So what does that look like? How much are these families actually earning?
Well, that's where the study gets really insightful because they don't just look at cash income. They break down household income into both cash and, what's often overlooked, non-cash benefits.
Non-cash benefits, remind me again what that covers in this context. Is it just that they've got, like, all-you-can-drink lassi on tap?
Well, I wouldn't say no to that, but think of more like the built-in perks of having this self-sustaining system, right? So yeah, the milk they consume themselves, which is huge in terms of nutrition, especially for families who might not have easy access to other sources of protein. But it also includes things like the draft power these animals provide, helping them plow their fields, for example. And then there's the manure, which is an incredibly valuable resource as fertilizer, sometimes even as fuel.
Oh, right, cow dung. It's amazing how we forget about these things when we're so used to buying everything at the store neatly packaged.
Exactly. And these non-cash benefits are not just a side note. They can be hugely significant for these families. In fact, for our smallest farm, the one we called IN2CO, those non-cash benefits, they actually make up 16% of their total household income.
Wow, 16%. That's a huge chunk. It's like having a whole extra cow, but made of, like, intangible benefits.
It really highlights why these small farms, even with their limited resources, low cash income, they manage to persist. It's about more than just profit margins. It's about a way of life, a safety net.
It's a really powerful reminder that success in this context can't just be measured in rupees, right? It's about providing for your family, staying afloat.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the resilience of these farmers, their ability to adapt and find ways to make it work, even when the odds seem stacked against them.
Okay, so we've talked about costs, we've talked about income, both cash and non-cash. But I'm dying to know who's coming out on top here. Which of these farm types are actually the most profitable?
All right, so get ready for a bit of a plot twist here, because you might expect the larger farms, with their economies of scale, to be raking it in. But one of the standout performers, according to the study, is actually IN6BO, our mid-sized farm, with the great buffaloes near the city.
Really? The buffaloes, I would have bet on a bigger operation. What's their secret sauce?
Efficiency. They've managed to keep their unit costs of milk production lower, which means each liter of milk they produce is actually cheaper for them to produce.
Ah, okay, so it's all about that cost per liter game. Fascinating. But what about our little guys, the IN2CO, with their 2 cows, holding on for dear life? Are they just barely scraping by?
Well, they're definitely not getting rich. Their cash income is quite low, but here's the thing, they persist. And the study suggests that this is partly due to limited alternative employment opportunities in the region. Dairy farming, even on a small scale, provides a vital safety net in an area where other economic opportunities might be scarce.
Right, so it's about more than just maximizing profit. It's about survival, about having a way to provide for your family when other options are limited.
Exactly. And it speaks to the complexity of the situation, the fact that there's all these factors at play, economic realities, social structures, even cultural values that influence how these farms operate.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all answer, no magic bullet.
Right. And speaking of comparisons, the study takes things a step further by pitting Orissa against another Indian state, Haryana, which is kind of like the Dairy King of India.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's like a milk-themed rap battle. Orissa versus Haryana. Drop the beat. So what makes Haryana such a dairy powerhouse?
Well, they've got the yields, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
They far surpass Orissa when it comes to milk production per animal. But here's where it gets interesting. The study found that despite these lower yields, milk production in Orissa is actually surprisingly cost competitive, even compared to Haryana.
Wait, really? How are they pulling that off? Are they like cutting corners somewhere? What's the deal?
No cutting corners. It actually comes down to a few key factors. First off, land costs in Orissa are significantly lower than in Haryana. Same goes for wages. So even though they're producing less milk per animal, their overall production costs are kept in check because those key input costs are lower.
So it's like a game of economic Tetris where they're figuring out how to make those lower costs fit in a way that allows them to stay competitive.
Exactly. But it's not just land and labor. Remember how we were talking about those non-cash benefits? Well, Orissa's abundance of grazing land actually plays a role here too. Farmers can rely more on natural resources to feed their animals, which reduces their dependence on expensive purchased feed. And that's a major cost factor for farmers in Haryana.
Fascinating. So Orissa's cows might not be breaking any yield records, but their environment is giving them a fighting chance in this economic battle.
Exactly. Plus, they've got another trick up their sleeve. Buffalo milk. Remember how we mentioned a couple of our typical farms were raising buffaloes? Well, the study actually highlights how competitive Orissa's buffalo milk production is.
Okay, buffalo milk, I'm intrigued. What's the deal with buffalo milk? Why is it the dark horse of the dairy world?
Well, it all comes down to fat content. Buffalo milk tends to have a higher fat content than cow's milk. And in many markets, especially in India, that higher fat content actually translates into better prices. So farmers who are raising buffaloes, especially those larger herds like our IN9BO, they're strategically positioned to benefit from that demand.
Ah, so they're playing to their strengths, using what they have to their advantage. Very clever.
It's all about adapting and finding your niche in a competitive market.
Absolutely. So we've seen how the milk is produced. We've dug into the costs, the profits, the unique challenges these farmers are facing. But how does it actually get from those farms to, say, my imaginary Lassie glass in Orissa? I mean, are we talking high-tech processing plants, supermarket shelves? Paint me a picture of what the Orissa dairy aisle looks like.
Well, you might want to put those supermarket images on hold because in Orissa, it's a whole different ballgame. Forget about aisles. We're talking about a system that's still largely dominated by the informal sector.
So instead of aisles, what are we talking about? Milk delivered by drone. What's the Orissa system look like?
Think way more low-tech, but in a way that's like woven into the culture. We're talking milkmen, often on bicycles, going door to door, or farmers themselves, selling directly to people at those local markets. It's a much more direct route from, well, udder to cup, I guess you could say.
Okay, I can see the charm in that, the connection to the source and all. But like with any system, I'm guessing there are some downsides to this whole informal setup.
Oh, absolutely. For one, there's that price volatility. Since it's not as regulated, those milk prices can fluctuate a lot, which, isn't great for the farmers trying to make a living or the families trying to afford their daily milk.
Makes sense. And then, of course, there's the whole quality control issue. I mean, with less oversight, I imagine ensuring the safety and quality of the milk is a whole other challenge, right?
Exactly. That's a major concern the study highlighted because without those stringent testing protocols you see in more formal systems, there's a higher risk of contamination, spoilage, or even, adulteration, which obviously raises some serious public health flags.
Right. Not ideal. So a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to this informal system for sure. But what about those dairy cooperatives we often hear about? The ones that are supposed to be like a force for good in the dairy sector. Are they making any headway in Orissa?
They are present, but honestly, their impact is surprisingly small. The study found that they only account for about 5% of the total marketable milk supply in Orissa.
Wow, 5%. That's like a drop in the bucket. Why aren't they more successful?
Well, it seems like they're kind of fighting an uphill battle against that deeply ingrained informal sector. Think about it. Those informal networks, they're built on local relationships, on accessibility, especially in those rural areas where a cooperative might not have a physical presence.
Yeah, it's hard to compete with that kind of convenience. And then, of course, there's the price factor.
Huge factor. Because those informal sellers can often afford to sell their milk at lower prices, even if it means, maybe cutting some corners on quality. So consumers, especially in a place like Orissa where every rupee counts, they're stuck in this tough spot trying to balance affordability with, well, peace of mind.
It's a really complex situation, especially for those cooperatives trying to do things the right way, but struggling to compete in a market that isn't always playing by the same rules.
It's a tough spot, no doubt. And then there's the fact that cooperatives, they tend to have higher operating costs compared to those informal sellers. I mean, they've got to invest in things like infrastructure, transportation, those more rigorous quality control measures we talked about. And all of that gets added to the final price of their milk.
So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, essentially, trying to keep their prices competitive while also dealing with these inherently higher production costs.
Exactly. And it creates this real challenge for them in terms of attracting consumers and, actually making a sustainable impact.
It's a real eye-opener, seeing those economic realities playing out in such a tangible way. So we've gone from these tiny farms, these resilient farmers working with incredibly limited resources, all the way to these complex market dynamics, the informal sector, the cooperatives struggling to find their footing. What's the takeaway? What are your final thoughts after this deep dive into Orissa's milk scene? For me, it really highlights how nuanced this whole issue is. It's not a simple story of boom or bust, of success or failure. It's about a system grappling with its own unique set of challenges. Those low yields, those market pressures from outside forces, and of course, the dominance of that informal sector with all its pros and cons.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most sustainable path forward isn't always the most obvious or the most efficient on paper. It's about finding a way to balance those economic realities with social needs and cultural values.
Absolutely. And while there are definitely challenges, there are also glimmers of hope. I mean, we see certain farms, like those focusing on buffalo milk, carving out their own niche and finding ways to thrive. And then there's the incredible resilience of these farmers, their ability to adapt and keep going, even when faced with these incredible obstacles. I mean, that's something to be admired.
It really is. And it makes you realize that there's no easy solution, no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing these complex issues.
Definitely. It's about working within the existing systems, understanding the nuances, and finding those targeted interventions, whether it's improving access to better breeding stock or strengthening those quality control measures that can make a real difference.
It's about empowering these farmers not just to survive, but to truly thrive. And there you have it, your deep dive into the fascinating world of milk production in Orissa, India. We've gone from those tiny farms to those bustling markets, unpacked the economics, and maybe even gained a new appreciation for that simple glass of milk.
From moo to market, we've covered it all.
Indeed. And we hope this deep dive has given you, our listeners, some food for thought, maybe even inspired you to explore some of these topics further on your own. And as always, if you come across a fascinating subject that you think deserves a deep dive, don't hesitate to send it our way. Until next time.
I got milk.